many writing specific lessons, so we haven't jumped on this quite yet because we've been familiarizing ourselves with the course and with the course material. But now you've read enough stuff and you've spent some time dialoguing with each other in discussions and sharing your assignments with me, that there is a sort of a working dialogue that you can have about the text. And so that's time for us to start writing. And so the biggest concern people have is, how in the world do I start this thing? It's very anxiety producing, understandably, and nobody likes to look at that blinking cursor. And so I want to narrow down a couple of ways that you can slide into this. And my number one way for getting any kind of work done, which is focusing on your quotations. So again, some of the stuff we're going to talk about, maybe it's review to you if you were like really hardcore in your language arts classes or literature classes. But we want to make sure that we're all on the same playing field, and ultimately make sure that our papers have the content that we need in them. Because it doesn't matter if you hit the page count if there just isn't enough stuff there, or if we're just repeating the same ideas. And so we're going to spend time later on in the summer, or probably maybe even next week, talking about clutter and how to make sure that we have quality over quantity. But first of all, how you can start is just by making sure you read the prompt. So last week's writing lab had you guys read the prompt, or I'm sorry, Mondays. What day is it? Monday's writing lab had you read the prompt. So a couple of people have emailed me to ask for clarification. That is right on. Make sure you understand what you're expected to do. Check in with me if you're confused. So that is number one. Number two is to choose your texts. So maybe one of the texts that you read from when we compared those two privilege texts, the TED Talk and Roxane Gay, maybe one of them stuck out to you. Maybe you've decided that you want to go for that Rankine article, or the other one, Theories and Constructs of Race. Choose which ones you would like. It might benefit you to just sort of skim through and see what sticks out to you, but prepare to close read. So just because you read it once, it doesn't mean that's good enough. That is not helpful when you are writing a paper. So close reading is when you're reading basically a second time, but it goes by way quicker because you're not reading word for word. You don't need to. You're looking for specific things. You're looking for quotes that are going to help you in this case. Help you write this paper and meet the requirements of the prompt. So for our next paper, you guys are going to be going a little bit deeper to look at sort of how something is constructed. But it's similar to when you're watching a film, or watching, let's say, The Office for like the 9th time, and you notice things that you didn't notice the first time, because the first time you're really just looking for like general understanding for what's going on in there. You want comprehension. You're getting the basics down, basic definitions, things like that, central ideas. The second time you read through it, that's when you can start noticing language, word choices. You can start noticing stuff that will stick out. Like when you'll notice the word privilege come up a lot more now that you know that you're writing a paper on privilege. So we're kind of in phase 2. That's where we want to be. Eventually we're going to work into phase 3 stuff, where we're actually looking at the way something is constructed in a visual way. We're going to end our semester talking about visual rhetoric, and even how things like this, an infographic, I love infographics, how this is a rhetorical choice that helps us understand content better. And there's an art to creating them and to synthesizing different images, so that we can read and analyze them. But it is impossible for us to write this paper without sifting through our readings one more time. And this is what I use the DEJ for. I mentioned before, like, I've used these. They got me through graduate school. And I also, because I have, learning differences, I have ADHD. It's a helpful way for me to stay organized. It's helpful for people who don't have a learning disorder or cognitive disorder to stay organized. But so I did that. I imagined that I was writing this paper, and I haven't made a definition yet, but I of what privilege would be. because I didn't want anybody to rip it off in their own paper. But I have been thinking about like how I define it or what some of the characteristics of privilege are. And I was rereading the ranking article that the New York Times Magazine one that wanted to know what white men thought about their privilege. So I asked, and something that kept sticking out to me was entitlement. And I don't think I saw that necessarily in the other text. So I made just a quick DEJ. It's not complete. This is from my second read. I was going through and looking for stuff that had to do with entitlement, and I had to just sort of stop myself. And I'll share this all in the module as a resource. But just an idea of some of the quotes that I'm working with. Some of these I ended up realizing they wouldn't really work. Like this one I don't think really fits, but it's not until I see them all together that I can start to imagine, like, okay, which of these like hang out together? Are there any of these that are connected in some way? I realized I really wanted to pull out like these terms of normalcy and universality, but I didn't really want to use this whole context. So I'm going to pick and choose what I want here, making sure that I'm still being respectful of the text. But it's a good time for you to find out like who are the weakest links of your quotes, which ones do you think are going to work best together. And this is before you've even started drafting your paper. Maybe, I had brainstormed, but like, oh, entitlement, I want to do something on that. And that's kind of all I had to go off of before I did this close read. I need to go let my cat out. Excuse me. I know. Yeah. Okay. So I'll start with this. And I know that they are 1/3 of what I'm going to need in each of my paragraphs. And I've mentioned before how this is a 4 to 5 page paper, and you can see on the prompt how that's kind of split. It's, one paragraph for the introduction, maybe 3 to 5 for these different characteristics or ways that you're defending your definition, 1 to 2 for your own anecdote, and then 1 for the conclusion. Of course, you can be a little flexible and add more to those if you want. So I like to think about things in that structural way. It helps me organize. It makes this not just seem like a gelatinous mess. So if any of you have baked before, there are certain ingredients in baking that just need to be there or you don't get anything good. Sort of the main ingredients, although it can be debated, for something like a cake, you need flour, you need sugar, you need some kind of binder, whether it's an egg or oil or whatever. And yes, I think that cakes are better if they have way more ingredients like that, but you could get away with making that and it is technically a cake. It may not be stupendous, but you've at least got the raw materials for a cake. However, if you ended up not putting the flour in there, you'd have a disgusting soupy mess. If you didn't have a binder, it would just be dry. And if you didn't have sugar, it would just be weird bread. So there are just these essential things you've got to have before you even worry about things like grammar or whatever. And this is it for us. It's claim, evidence, and reasoning. You must have those in every single paragraph or else it just doesn't work. And we function this way normally when we're communicating. If you are arguing with a friend, not even arguing, but just sort of discussing, let's imagine all the restaurants are open and you're debating whether you should get pho or ramen, and you're saying it has to be ramen. Ramen is the best because I feel like that's too. I don't think I could make that argument. I think too many people would be mad at me if I made that. So we'll just say instead, In-N-Out is the best fast food ever. That is a claim, but not really yet. A claim would be In-N-Out is the best ever because their food is very fresh. That's a claim. That's an argument you have, and now you've got to defend that. So your friend's like, no, it's not, or, what do you mean? Then you have to explain that and say like, well, look, I'll give you some evidence. When you're going through the drive-through, you can see them sort of cutting the fries from the potatoes like in front of you, and it's very fun to watch, and I think it'd be really fun to do. So that's a piece of evidence. It's not quoted, but you're like, look, here's a thing that proves to me, and should prove to you, that they are fresh. And then you'll have to explain that. Why is cutting potatoes in front of you in the drive-thru, why is that evidence of freshness? It's like, well, their food's not frozen in the same way that a lot of other fast food places are. And if that potato is served fresh, it pretty much follows that a lot of, maybe not logically, but that a lot of their other food is fresh. And you could bring in other pieces, other examples that indicate how fresh their food is. Maybe go on their website and give statistics of or like farms where they get their stuff. I don't know. I'm making all of this up. But that is an argument. It's just how we function normally. But somehow it seems to all fall apart when we are writing a paper and we forget like how to talk. And so this is where my method of building paragraphs comes from. It is called OREO. Perhaps in your high school classes or previous writing classes, they had something similar that had layers. I know when I was in high school or middle school or something, they used the sandwich, but I always thought that was garbage because there's so many different types of sandwiches, and also there's so many different elements in there, like tomato and lettuce and I don't know, some sort of meat. There's like too many things. When I think that we can be a little bit more low key about it, but still keep in mind like what a paragraph needs to be. And so I like Oreos because they're simple. There's just 2 cookies. There's this weird vegan non-dairy cream in the middle of it. And so that will help us figure out what to do, with our evidence and actually end up helping us get all 3 of these together by just starting with this evidence and working our way outwards. Keep in mind, right now, my only claim is like entitlement. Entitlement has something to do with privilege. So I haven't quite worked out the language for that yet because I don't write my topic sentences until after I've talked about all of this stuff, because then I can just summarize what I wrote and then make it the topic sentence. So for now, I'm just going to focus on evidence, but you'll see when we do that, we inevitably have to consider our main claim and we have to reason and explain why this evidence is helping me make that. So it ends up being this kind of cyclical situation. So let's break it down. If you do have some cookies near you, some Oreos, you can sort of use them as a visual aid. And I'm so sorry, my dears, if we were in class, I always do bring Oreos, which is really great when it's like a 4 o'clock class and everybody's just dying and sleeping. So this cookie has a couple different jobs. So it prepares the reader of your paper for words that don't belong to you. And it also shows who those words belong to and establish ethos of like, why should we listen to them? And it helps us understand what's happening around the quote in the original writing. So let's keep in mind that your quote is super delicate, much like this very fluffy baby bird with an old man haircut. These quotes are they're the weird smushy cream. So imagine if usually people go in and like, I had a little brother who would lick the cream out of the Oreos and put the soggy cookies back. It was disgusting. But imagine it was the opposite. Imagine that you had a sibling who ate the cookies and just left the weird cream. It would be very messy if you opened it up and it was just all cream. It would go everywhere. It would melt into each other. Those cookies are there because it keeps everything separate and you're able to actually digest it. I'm going crazy with metaphors right now, but that is your quote. It's really messy on its own and it's very dangerous and delicate. And so you have to make sure that you're padding it on each side, or else it's very easy for something to turn into plagiarism or to just be useless and lack any analysis. And keep in mind, a paper that does not have your own analysis cannot pass. If I just get summary papers, you're not doing the college level stuff. So the OREO method helps sort of force analysis and to check that off on a checklist before you move on. So already talked about that. First things first. We've got to introduce the quote. We cannot just start a sentence with quotation marks because there's a lot of questions there. Who is talking? It matters if Donald Trump or Obama said something. You want to know who said those things. It can have very dire consequences. And so I want to give her last name. We never use the first name. This is not our BFF. So I don't want to see something like Claudia or Roxanne. Use their last names. The first time you introduce them, for sure, use their full name so we know who they are. Because again, you're writing this to people who have not read this. And it's also important because you're switching between different sources. You're using Blindspot and then, in my case, Rankine, and then also another author. So I want to make sure that people understand, like, oh, this quote here is from this person. We need some kind of a comma or some kind of a signal phrase, and we want to make sure it's active. We don't want to say said, even though, yeah, she said it in the past. But the idea is that we're reading this now, and this is something that's informing our understanding now. And it feels kind of weird, especially with something historical, like if you're reading Emily Dickinson and you say, like, Emily Dickinson says, it's like, well, she didn't. She's been dead forever. But we're still using her language, and so it is technically alive. And so sort of the rule is, if you have a signal phrase like this, so a signal verb, you have a comma after it. There's also ways that you can structure that that use a noun. So if I said, Rankin discusses her interaction with a friend, that would be a colon instead of a comma. And there's lots of different signal phrases. Oh no, did I not link it up? Oh no. Let's see. No, I didn't. That's very disappointing. I feel like I do this every single Prezi. Forget to link up one thing. Gonna find. There it is. All the way up there. Mix it up. So if you're wondering, we'll talk more about like, what is the difference between a B and an A? And something like this, a variety of language can be the difference between a B and an A, of showing like, oh, look, this is an engaging paper to read. We're not just saying says a million times. And I literally just Googled signal phrase and I took a screenshot of it. And sometimes I reference these when I'm writing an email and I feel like I'm being repetitive, and I'll choose something that's a little bit different. Keep in mind, not all of these are created equal. If I'm having somebody like say something, I may not say something like maintains or questions. Like that literally wouldn't make sense. But if someone was questioning, I wouldn't want to say contends. Also, don't use language that you're not familiar with. I don't want anybody to use, where is it? It's around here somewhere. What is it? Is it purports? Purports. I've never heard anybody use that in my life. So only use language that you are familiar with, and it's good to learn new words, but if it's super unfamiliar to you, it's going to stick out in your writing too. So perhaps you notice that I have her name and then I have her name at the end in the citation, the MLA citation. This is a controversial stance. I do it because oftentimes there will be a different person speaking than is actually cited, and it's easy to just forget to cite, and then that's a problem. So I always say double cite. It will not get you in trouble. If it seems like just overload, you are welcome to sort of pay attention to what needs that citing and what doesn't. But I just see that it's very spotty when people choose to not cite at the end, especially because sometimes, again, we don't know who that person is, if they're responding to somebody else, if it's a quote-unquote character or a source that they brought in. So, for example, this was something that I put into my DEJ a little later down. Set of assumptions, privileges, benefits, company the status of being white have become a valuable asset that whites have sought to protect. But Rankin didn't say that. She actually was quoting from something else. She was quoting from Cheryl Harris's article, Whiteness as a Property, from the Harvard Law Review in 1993. So I can't, just set this guy down. That's not going to be good enough, because I'm now misinterpreting what she's saying, and it may matter. So here's how I would fix that. And it does seem like kind of a mouthful, but we've got to be careful. So I still include that it's from Rankin because I'm switching off. So Rankin cites Cheryl Harris's 1983 Harvard Business Review article, Whiteness as Property, saying, and I forgot my comma there. That's my mistake. And then the quote. But I still cite her because that's where I got this information from. If I had read Harvard Business Review, then I would use that citation. But that's not where I got this information. So that's probably one of the most requested questions, the most questioned, when we're talking about quotes, and it does feel awkward, but this is the responsible way that we need to do it, to make sure that everybody is having proper attribution. Oh, there it is. Don't even need that anymore. Lastly, for cookie one, we need context. So the audience didn't read the source. You know this is for somebody outside of our class. So, for example, this quote, I wanted to ask him if his expectation was a sign of his privilege. Great. I love that quote because it connects privilege and expectation. I'm going to use the hell out of it. However, who is him and his? his privilege. That makes absolutely no sense. So if you just drop that into a paper, if I drop that into a paper, my reader is going to be really confused what we're talking about. And you don't have to summarize the entire article for them. It's kind of on a need-to-know basis. So I went to that area and I skimmed through. It's like, oh, okay, that part was about this friend who didn't get the job he applied for. And it's all about him like doing this sort of weird pseudo woke thing where he's like, oh, it's my punishment from, my forefathers. But it's kind of still a little bit of a dick move, the way that he focuses on race like that. And I want to bring that up of like, yeah, he's acting like he's entitled. So I think I'm going to change up. I think I'm going to change up and put it at the beginning. And so I put, after reflecting on a white friend's recent lament over a missed job opportunity, Rankine observes, and then I'm good to go. That doesn't tell me everything, because I'm going to end up going in after this and probably adding a few more details. I don't want to overload it at the beginning, because then we'll forget like what we're talking about when we get to the quote. But just some sort of signal of like, hey, this is what this is about. Hold on, I'm going to explain it later. Also, if you're ever worried about the page count, this is your golden ticket. Looking before and after quotes to see if there's any context that you can add. That's so much better than just repeating yourself in 2 paragraphs and think that I won't notice, but I always notice because it's just fluffy. This doesn't take a lot of brain power to do, and it's actually useful information. So for our filling, it's the quote, you know what to do, make sure it's cited. Couple questions I always get about paraphrasing, especially because in the last lecture I alluded to paraphrasing. You can absolutely do it. Paraphrasing is when you are not using the direct quote, you're kind of putting things in your own words. That's great to do, but it still needs a citation because even though it's your words, it's their idea. And I would say you should privilege quoted material. It just works better. It makes you look better as a writer because your reader isn't going to be wondering if maybe you're misinterpreting something. And there takes out the fear of like, oh gosh, what if I accidentally plagiarize? I always err towards direct quoting unless I have a really complicated idea or something really long. So looking at my DEJ, I'm thinking like I'm going to have to do a lot of paraphrasing to explain the Yale dad thing. I'm not going to just use the whole thing as a quote of her interaction. I have to put some of that into my own words. But that's not my own idea. That's just kind of summarizing to catch us up to speed so I could look at the kinds of quotes that I pulled out of there. And lastly, cookie 2, which is the hard one, but it's the most important one. The other ones don't take up a lot of brain power, the other cookie and the quote, except finding the quote, I guess. But cookie 2 is where the college level stuff comes in and where your own idea comes in. And most of your grade comes from this second cookie, not to scare you. But this second cookie, it justifies why we're using this in the first place. We have to justify every move that we make in a paper, especially our quotes. We want to make sure that we're accurately representing what the other person is saying and maybe even explaining it to them, and that's optional. If a quote is really obvious, you don't need to break it down, but if it has a lot of technical language or if it needs more context, like our other quote kind of did, you're going to want to break that down to get to what the meaning of it is. Clearing up anything lost in translation, I just already mentioned context. And most importantly, analyzing, showing how this helps our argument, which my argument for this paragraph is that privilege, part of the definition of privilege involves entitlement, that's an aspect of privilege. And so I want to make sure that my reader knows how this quote is helping us understand that connection. So the first thing we can do, and this is another area where if you're low on the word count, you can go after the quotes and see like, okay, anything I can break down here. I don't want people, breaking down a quote that just says like, he was happy, and then you're like, happiness is a state of exhilaration. It's like, no, we don't need to break down things like that. But we'll talk about this more when we start finding our own research or dealing with technical research, where you kind of have to assume that your reader is dumb. And it's okay to break that down. It's not going to offend them. It's actually better because your reader's not sitting next to you and they can't ask, for clarification. You have to kind of provide all of that to them ahead of time. So I took my same quote, what I had before, is in the purples, and I added this part in the pink because I just wanted to make sure that people understood. Like, reading just this part, this purple part, I'm like, that's kind of confusing. I don't think they're really getting at what she means by expectation there. I need to talk a little bit more about like why he is, so sad, or his attitude towards the missed job opportunity. Again, this isn't my analysis. I didn't make this up. I'm just explaining, like, here's what I got from this. Here's what she's trying to say. And so I added, the friend depicted the snub as punishment for his forefathers' enslavement of black people, but his reasoning insinuates that were it not for the historical wrongdoing, the job would have been and should have been his. So my goal is to get at what was bothering Rankine so much. What about this was expectation? But we wouldn't have known this part about the whole punishment thing beforehand. So this does add a lot of context, and it also just makes sure, hey reader, you get what I'm saying here, right? You get how this is connected to expectation. I'm going to now explain like why this is important. And lastly, we analyze it. So thinking about what my purpose is, I want to help explain that entitlement encompanies privilege. I think this quote totally does it. I know this looks horrifying, but what's in black is what I've already written, and I'm adding what is in blue. First thing to take note of here is this is half, if not a little more, than the rest of my writing. And that's the ratio that we're going for with analysis. Your analysis should be the majority of your paper because you're responding to this stuff. So I like to do a highlighting thing like this when I'm writing. I'll highlight what I think is more summary and context and stuff, and then I'll highlight in a different color, in this case blue, what are my own ideas? What's the point that I'm trying to make about this? And sometimes it's tough to figure out which is which, but usually saying, is this summary? Could somebody else get this from the text? Is helpful for me. I want to make sure that I've got a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio actually of analysis. So here's what I said. Similar to Rankine's interaction with the two white male businessmen in first class. I realized I could take out male there because I said businessman. Good catch. Her friend assumed this job was the space he should occupy, like first class is a space those men should occupy, and did not stop to recognize the underhanded comment as anything other than a fact. He did not question his own qualifications or considered that the other candidate might have had skills that he lacked. Although not actively trying to protect this valuable asset of whiteness, the interaction demonstrates the sense of entitlement that accompanies privilege. So this whole thing has been like, I want to show you how this is proving that privilege is a part, or expectation is a part of privilege. And so this was that explanation. And I did a couple things in here that count as analysis. I made comparisons. Comparisons are a great way to build analysis because you're putting two different ideas together and justifying why they work together. And my comparison was bringing in the male businessman. I compared the interaction of her friend to the businessman and explained why that was actually similar, sort of deep down. She didn't make that connection. I mean, I think it's implied in there, but I was the one who made that argument. I also read between the lines, so I don't know anything about him, whether he recognized or didn't recognize his comment as offensive, but from what I read, it seems that he did not understand it. It seems that he didn't question his own qualifications. So in many ways, I'm guessing here, and that's kind of what argument and analysis is. You, to the best of your knowledge and what you can assess, think that this is what's happening in the text. And as long as you can justify it, as long as it makes sense, then you're good to go. I believe that my argument is correct. I don't think that he thought about his own qualifications, especially since he was being all, woe is me, the sins of my fathers. Like, it's all scapegoating on somebody else, not like, oh man, I wish I knew what that other candidate had. And lastly, I reinforced my claim, tied this back to more generally what I'm talking about, clearly saying that this demonstrates that entitlement accompanies privilege. So all of this is on the resource sheet that I'm posting, but this is what this looks like broken down. All of the context is in pink. The quote's obviously blue. My tiny signal phrase introduction is in orange, and then the analysis is in green. I did the same thing with another quote that I thought was pretty similar. The whole thing about the father and his son, who was waitlisted at Yale, and he's saying, oh, it's, he was rejected because he couldn't play the diversity card. It was Asians flooding the Ivy Leagues, doing literally the exact same thing as this friend up here of like, oh, this is the fault of other people, and I am suffering from it. My son is suffering from it and not considering themselves. So I was like, sweet. Those two quotes go really nicely together. And you don't have to have two quotes. I could just stop here and make this a paragraph, but I think it actually benefits from having another quote on there. So if you can add more quotes, absolutely do it. But I Oreo'd this guy as well. And what's really cool about this is that this, if I put it together, is my entire paragraph. I don't have to do anything else except for write a topic sentence, which is my argument. And so I did it. I wrote this in probably, 20 minutes, maybe a little less. And what's great is that this actually is almost a page. This is maybe a little long. I might have to cut some stuff down here. The only thing I added beyond what was here, other than making it in Times New Roman and taking out the color and things like that, I added this sentence up here. Since those holding privileged historically hold positions of power and autonomy, I have holding twice. Oh, man, proofing matters. It is easy to develop a sense of entitlement over these spaces. That's what I'm arguing. And then these are the two paragraphs or the two Oreos you saw before. So if you're worried about how to fill your paper up, this is not something that requires skill. This just requires the patience of going about this systematically. And so if you have other ways to write, that is absolutely fine, as long as you are filling the requirements of, we need a claim, which I have up here, and everything in my paragraph is going to help make this claim appear. I have evidence. I'm not just sort of making it up. And I have a lot of my own reasoning and analysis to explain what this means and why it matters for my argument. And this paragraph as well is going to be posted on the resource sheet. Yours may not be this long. That's fine. I'm a little bit of an overwriter, but I want to show you what you can do. So if I was writing my paper, this took me 20 minutes and I need maybe like 3 to 5 more like this. So that's going to be, an hour and a half-ish, maybe less than that. And then I write an intro and a conclusion. And then the one paragraph about my anecdote, which should go a little bit quicker. And my paper is done. So it's really easy to think that there's just some sort of magical way, like you either have the skills to write or you don't, when really it just takes this kind of building and engineering from the inside out. So I hope this is a good resource for you. I need you to know that I still use this when I'm writing articles. So the same methods that I want to share with you, that I am sharing with you, are the same ones that got me through grad school, through college, and are helping me within academia now. And it works for any kind of writing. It's not just term paper writing. Anything that you have to write that has an argument, you're going to have to give evidence and explain it and make a solid claim about it. That's universal. So go out there, make some Oreos. Your assignment for this writing lab, your last writing lab this week, is a very broken down version of Oreo where I'm just looking for the quotes that you want to use, and then just generally what that paragraph is going to be about. And that will end up being a sub for a topic sentence. So just quotes and topic sentences. That's it. And what I want to do when I go through those is see is there a better, a better way to organize this, or are we lacking in something? And then once you turn in your rough draft on Sunday, I'll be able to give you more specific comments. All right. Have a very sweet, delicious night.